Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to Bible Study Live, happening a couple of days early. So if you're like, why on earth are they doing Bible Study Live on a Monday night? Sorry, we had to move it this month, but
Can
we're
you
really
do
glad
that?
that you're here with us. We can do that. We can absolutely do that. I am here today with some wonderful folks, one of whom you know, and one of whom you might not know yet, or you might know if you've watched our TMC worship services. So, I'll introduce myself and then we'll pass it around. My name is Austin. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the executive director here at Transmission Ministry Collective. I'm going to throw it over to Peter.
Hi, I am Peter. Pronouns are they, them. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator here at TMC.
Hi, my name's Samantha. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a moderator on the TMC Discord.
True that, and a great moderator at you are. Well, I'm really glad that you all can be here, and I'm glad that folks can be watching this live or after the fact. I know we have a lot of folks who watch after the fact, which I always love. Um, so today we are talking about a story, a classic sort of post-Easter story. We are now in the Easter season. If your church is a sort of liturgical church year church, you know that you're in the Easter season because we are past Easter. And if you're in a church that maybe doesn't follow a church year cycle like that, you might be like, well, we're just kind of on to the next thing, like Easter is over. But Easter kind of continues, and we're going to continue to talk about Easter through the next month or so, because the resurrection doesn't just stop happening after we're done talking about Easter Sunday. So today we're talking about a story that happens after the resurrection, specifically in John chapter 21. So that's what we're talking about today, John 21. Um, and we're going to talk about the whole chapter, which is kind of exciting. I like when we get to do whole chapters. So why don't we talk first about what versions of the Bible we're reading from today? I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. How about you two?
I am reading from the old Revised Standard version. So
Nice. And what Bible is that, Sam?
this is the New Oxford Annotated Bible with
Nice.
Apocrypha. So
Very nice.
this one's it's a fun one. It's a good, this one is a flex to carry around. I don't know. It looks
Big,
brainy.
impressive.
Yeah.
It looks serious. I've got the updated version too, so I think I'll have your same version, Austin.
Okay, cool. And if there are folks in the chat that want to share what version they're reading from, go ahead and do that. Hi, Amory, good to see you. So go ahead and do that if you feel like adding what version you're reading from as well. There is going to be a point when I'm going to geek out about translations. So just prepare yourself for that. That's definitely going to happen. So let's start out with our story today. We don't have to give a whole lot of background or context for this, other than it's just after the resurrection. So Jesus has shown up. This is the Gospel of John. So in previous chapters, in the previous chapter, we had the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene outside the tomb, and then Jesus shows up to the disciples in the locked room, and then sees Thomas, and Thomas is like, holy crap, I thought I would never see it and believe it, but I do. And so that all happened in the previous chapter. And this chapter is the last chapter of the Gospel of John. That's what we're looking at today. So why don't we start off with the first section, verses 1 through 14. And we've got 3 sections here. So I'll go ahead and read this first section. We can each take one. So I'll start us. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 14. So it goes like this. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, no. He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So, third appearance. Here we are. It's happening. And there's a lot we can say about this. So we're going to kind of start out at the beginning of that piece, which starts off with Simon Peter saying, "Y'all, I'm going fishing. I'm putting a gone fishing sign on my door, and I'm leaving, and I'm going to go on vacation." So I wonder, and this is going to happen a lot in this conversation, I think, is I'm going to say Peter and then look at Peter and be like, "Peter, what do you think?"
Yes, this is one of my namesake stories. I love it.
Yeah. So tell me about your thoughts on this early Peter going fishing bit.
Yeah, I'm really I'm especially struck in this early part of the passage with the way it reflects back to like the initial call of the disciples,
Mm,
because we first find them fishing, and we joke about them going on vacation, but obviously that was their job.
right.
And that was the life that they led prior to meeting Jesus. And this is sort of a parallel to like this initial call that Jesus makes into their lives. They're fishing, and he says, it like guides them towards this miraculous catch of fish, and then calls them into discipleship. Um, so I'm interested by the fact that uh, well, kind of the question of why they returned to fishing after they sort of
Mhm.
left that life behind, to follow this call. And then, even after the resurrection, I feel like it might kind of indicate the state of mind they're still in. Or
Mm,
to me, it almost feels like a sort of fear or insecurity. They've, especially for Peter, like, he's just betrayed Jesus. He's just denied his relationship with Jesus. So like, is there something here of the disciples feeling inadequate, uh, sort of in response to their own failures or their own weaknesses, and sort of retreating into what feels simple and familiar to them, which is this previous life they had.
right.
Um, so I'm just
Yeah,
kind
I feel yeah, that feels very familiar to me in that there are some days when I'm just like, I am so over trying. Like, you
of
know what? I could just always go back and work at the bakery that I used to work at. Like, it'd be a simpler life.
yeah.
and, and I sometimes wonder if that was that feeling. Does that strike anything for you, Sam? Have you had feelings like that?
I mean, yeah, like as life goes on, and as we try to do, the life of faith, and then trying to make communities better and doing all of it, like most of us are not in full time ministry, right? So I think one of what strikes me a little differently about this, and I wonder if hey, why did they go back to the old ways? I wonder if that might be a bit harsh of a read on what they were
Mm,
doing. Because, even if they were in the process of, having the conversations of like, okay, so what now? You know, like he's back, but we don't see him a lot. And so I guess we're in the next phase of things, but what do we do? Like fishing is still like how how they make money and eat.
mhm,
And so to me, when I read this, I get less of a sense of they were on the verge of giving up and going back and feeling inadequate, and more just this is a reinvigoration of the sacredness of the mundane stuff they have to do, right? Because like
mhm,
I if you read this as a a throwback, right, to the initial call, they're out, things Jesus just showed up a couple times. Everything's kind of weird because, like, okay, the big supernatural stuff happened, but also nothing's happened yet. So I'm going fishing. We got to eat.
Mhm.
And just, I love the picture of, they're out fishing and just the voice on the shore going, catch anything? No, throw it out on the other side. And just like the grin starting to show up,
Yeah,
of
it's like
like, oh
we've heard that
yeah,
before. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it is in this mundane moment, this callback to the, like, no, remember, like, there's a mission here, and it made that mundane moment special again. And so that's how I see it, like a reconsecrating of the normal stuff that still kind of has to happen because they were a ways off from the full-time starting a new religion phase of things.
Mhm.
I really like that. Well, and either way, like with either of those two interpretations, like I like the idea of the fact that Jesus's call is not a one-time thing. You
Mhm.
know, it's like he'll keep calling. You know,
Mhm.
like uh, and even though it feels the same and also different. You know, also new.
Totally.
Yeah,
That feeling
though.
is really
Yeah,
familiar.
interesting, like, kind of narrative wrench a little bit, because like that's a lot of the thinking, a lot of the ways that I process this story, and a lot of what feels like an obvious use of it in this kind of like callback, right, is that story is not in the Gospel of John. And so, in with the Gospel of John as a self-contained narrative, this isn't a throwback to their call because that's not in
Right.
this story.
Yeah.
And so that is an interesting interpretive thing to put on it, that like this was not some, like, hey, remember this, which, like, I feel like if you ever do a Jesus movie, or like when they do this, like that's how you would frame that, right? Just like, oh,
Right.
you, when the when the fish start coming back up. But in the Gospel of John, that's not there. It's likely the authors knew that story because they're putting it,
Right.
they put a miraculous catch on the other side of the boat in the story. They either had the text because it's likely John was written later, or just knew it in a traditional way. But there's the other read of it where, like, instead of it being a callback, right, what's being said by moving this call story to the end?
Yeah.
And that's, like, I don't have a great answer for that, but that's something I didn't, like, I don't think about. I've thought about as I was making notes for this, that, like, John probably wasn't doing a callback because he didn't write the first part.
Right. I feel like at the same time, though, John relies so much on what he thinks the reader already knows about Jesus, like
Hmm.
in the way of like the stories had been in the air at the time. So I kind of like that. I almost wonder if John intentionally has that because he knows that people have a sense of that story already,
Yeah.
even though John didn't intentionally include it. I don't know. It's fascinating stuff thinking about these. I'm noticing on the chat here, thinking about the sort of like maybe being at loose ends, maybe being afraid, and kind of going back to places that are familiar. I see, hang on, I'm going to get this right. Aniacal says, it seems as though they're trying to regain a sense of normalcy. And Sophia says, as someone gender expansive, I feel like it would be easier to conform to the binary on occasion. Yeah. So that sense of like, maybe you just need to go back and be invisible again. And like, maybe that's an okay thing to do in that moment. You had a quote, I think, Peter, about this.
Yeah, I found this little reflection on this passage on the Salt Project. They have a lot of scripture commentary. And it said, faced with our own shortcomings, we suspect we are disqualified or unqualified, or in any case, incapable of contributing to the movement. We drift back to our old lives in Galilee. Or perhaps we sense the power of new life, the promises of the risen Jesus, even the helpful contributions we might make, but we're afraid. Being a disciple is one thing, following along beside the good rabbi, but being an apostle is another, sent forth up ahead into the unknown. And so we draw back, we retreat, we return to what we know, letting down and pulling up the old empty nets. But Jesus will not let us go. Though we may waver, Jesus continues to believe. God knows our shortcomings and calls and sends us anyway.
Oh, that's so good. Like the sort of relentlessness in a positive sense of Jesus, because we're going to see that again in the next section of this story.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, it feels connected to that for me as well.
mhm. So the next thing that happens is the disciples, they don't at first recognize Jesus. At first, they're kind of like, who's talking to us, right? And it reminds me of the other like stories in the last chapter of John where people don't recognize Jesus right away, right? Where Mary is standing at the tomb and doesn't recognize Jesus until he says her name. Where I'm thinking about the story in Luke of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where they're walking with Jesus this whole time and Jesus is talking to them, but they don't recognize that it's him. And I think that's it's because it's sort of a standard of these resurrection stories that people don't recognize Jesus right away. I always wonder why that is. And so when I think about the story of like Mary and not recognizing Jesus, I think my favorite interpretation of that is that she's so like blinded by like sorrow in almost like a physical way, like you can't see
Mhm.
through your tears, you know? And I like that idea of her expecting sorrow and then not being able to recognize joy because the sorrow's in the way. And so I wonder here why it is that the disciples don't recognize Jesus right away. And I don't really have a good answer for that.
I
Um,
mean, I think that plays nice into the idea, right, that this is supposed to be a mundane moment that maybe they don't connect with what they're doing, right?
yeah, true.
They're in fishing mode, even if this is in service to something bigger, they're not thinking about it. And so, when it's Jesus is doing something with them and for them during this normal time, and so they're not looking for him because they think this is we're just fishing. This isn't a ministry thing.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and because that's why I like this as a contrast for like a day job type thing, right?
Mhm.
Because they're when I'm at work doing my spreadsheets for 8 hours a day, it's easy to not be keeping an eye out for Jesus during that.
Yeah, legit. It's hard to imagine that you'll find Jesus in spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then we get this moment where somebody does recognize Jesus, and it's not the
Mhm,
person that you might think, right? So Sam,
mhm.
who's the person you think is going to recognize Jesus, and then who actually does?
Right, because Peter would be the throwback, right? Because it's happened
Mhm.
before, and he's been the one interacting. You recognize him on the water and all of that, but it says that nobody recognizes him, and it says the disciple Jesus loves recognizes Jesus before Peter,
Who the
which
heck is who's that?
right, yeah, because that's a phrase that is used in the Gospel of John quite a bit,
Mhm.
which is an interesting little interesting little moniker. Um, but it's also, I feel like this also gives a slight point to the maybe narratively also that I don't know, the initial miraculous fish call maybe wasn't part of this narrative, because it seems like even less likely, seems really unlikely that Peter would not get what was happening when the guy's like, hey, try it out the other side. Because
Mhm.
that feels like a direct reference to like the thing I said a month ago.
Right.
And so I don't know, like if there's just a point there. But
I mean, it's
calling
3
it
years ago, to be fair.
What'd you say, Peter?
It was 3 years ago, to be fair.
To
3 years
be
ago,
fair, it was
yeah,
a minute ago. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, so it says the disciple Jesus loved, and the Gospel of John says that a few times, um, and it says it a few times again here, which is interesting because I mean it's interesting just because it's a weird way to write. It's this weird like nickname, and at the beginning of this chapter they give like the list of people who are here,
Mhm.
and so like I'm like, why don't you just tell us? So
Yeah.
you've said a name already.
It says a
Um,
bunch of names, and then it says, and two other of his
right.
disciples. So like,
And then
who?
right. Yeah, plus two, and then the best one said this.
Yeah, we're not going to tell you though.
Right. Right. Is the one he loved one of the ones one of the maybe one of the two we didn't name. They don't have names, but maybe it's just someone else. Um, but there's much ado made about this
Yeah.
because the traditional, and I feel like the most obvious answer is that it's John, that fits in a lot of the narratives when that phrase gets used. It fits here. It does, like, because he was one of the ones named, and so it does make it kind of the strange giving a nickname to someone named already.
Right.
But the end of the chapter basically says that the disciple that Jesus loved is the one who wrote this epistle. And so obviously traditionally it's been John, because that's what we've named the gospel.
Mm.
And it fits narratively with things that have happened in the past, but people love their theories. There's while John is the most accepted one, um you mentioned in the notes Lazarus is one that some people have said just because there is affection to Lazarus in the stories. And then there is a fun, popular one that says it was Mary Magdalene,
Mhm.
which I ended up doing a lot more reading about about that than I thought. I still think John is the most obvious one, and like I
Mhm.
also think John makes sense both in the narrative structure, both with kind of with like the historical theory that this letter was that the Gospel of John was edited and compiled by John's students, and
Mhm.
so that kind of like also gives a good reason they might be using kind of a higher like nickname, like this is our guy from the school we follow, so he's
He's
the
the best
special
one.
one. Yeah, so he obviously the best one. And then it fits, which is just especially in like really early Christianity, the way that some that writing scripture, there's some sort of like I was really close to an apostle or close to Jesus, and I got special knowledge because John is one kind of with more special knowledge asides about the what was really going on. And
Mhm.
so John being the one who was like real buddy buddy like is also a good narrative like way for that to happen. But I thought it was interesting to read some of the Mary theories, which I early on have generally just been like, yeah, okay, whatever, that's fun to imagine, I guess. I was reading them, and some of the arguments that people make in reference to it are that one, if the disciple that Jesus loved was a woman, they may want to keep that kind of under wraps because it kind of hurts the credibility of the story. And
Mhm.
especially if she's the one authoring an epistle, it
Mhm.
probably is definitely not gonna spread. There is a when I when it first clicked and I was like, oh, am I getting into this? Was when like a common like con of that interpretation is that when Jesus reveals himself to Mary, goes and talks to the disciple Jesus loves. Like there's a scene
Right.
where Mary and this disciple interact, but it's pointed out that a different version of the word love is used in that specific one and no one else. And it's like, oh, was she
Mm.
was she touching it? So
Have we ever seen them in the same room together?
right. And then some of and like some and then and like some like Renaissance art depicts her as the disciple that
Mhm.
Jesus loved. And it was I still think John's more likely, but I read that and then when I read all the theories, I ended up slightly more Mary pilled than I thought it was gonna be.
Fair
You
enough.
really did go down some rabbit holes, didn't you?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And also just with some of the research that's come out like recently, right? Like the stuff that Becky Schrader found about how there was originally like how Martha may have not existed in the earlier text and was added later to kind of downplay some of Mary Magdalene's roles perhaps in it.
Mm.
And I know that in like a lot of Gnostic text and just kind of like more side stuff like Mary Magdalene was really important in a lot of non-canonical texts. And so I don't know, this sort of like maybe this was part of that tradition and they were squishing down her involvement. It's fun, it's a fun theory.
Right. These are I like when we get to look at like different theories that people have about this stuff because it um not to say that any traditional theory that we may have grown up with is like wrong or bad or inaccurate, but to just know that there are multiple ways of thinking about these texts. I think something
Mhm.
that's really important, especially if you grew up in a context like I did that was uh where you kind of had to believe one thing or
Right.
else.
Mhm.
To be able to hold multiple possibilities of what this could mean feels really important in sort of embracing a more holistic and healthy faith, that
Right.
this
And
doesn't have to threaten us, you know?
if we weren't supposed to like speculate and have theories about it, I feel like they could have easily just told us who it was in the book and that would have solved all
True.
this. So
Right. Well, I'll give you my reasons when we get to it about why I think it was maybe Lazarus, but we'll get there.
okay.
We'll get there. I'm looking here at the chat here. Um,
I like
uh,
Aniacles that was Mary's self-insert OC.
yeah, I love
and
that.
there was a wonderful but plain-looking but strong-hearted young girl that really got Jesus's attention, even though everyone else said she was too normal.
I love that. And I like Amory's here. Amory points out the similar ambiguity in the Luke Acts. So we generally think of Luke and Acts as being written by the same person, right? And in Acts, we get the dedication to Theophilus, which literally just means God, lover of God, right? So like it could have been a proper name, or it could have been it could have been a proper name for a specific person, or it could have just been like to all lovers of God, and we don't know. So I like that Amory made that connection there with like a sort of nickname that could have been multiple different people. So let's see. We got to move ahead because we're going too slow to get through all this. Let's move for a second to the weird number of fish that show up in this story. Because in this story we get Jesus, they pull up this net, right? And it says, let's see, in verse 11, Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And so, of course, I think a lot of people, when they read this, they immediately go to the footnotes and are like, why 153, right? And this is, again, another theory thing. So, Sam, as you're our
Yes.
theory person today, tell us about the 153 fish.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the Mary theories were not the weird rabbit hole I went on. I was reading theories about why the 153, and what's fun is that almost every thinker you find has a different answer for this, because everyone agrees that is a very strangely specific number. Like in Bible era books, you almost always round it, right? Like it's, you would say 150, or you'd say 200, or you'd give it some obvious like special number, like if it's 40, or if it's
7,
12 or 7. There's this is a weird number. So it's 153, and I looked up and found several theories. The most, I guess, normal ones, the ones that respectable publications will put in Bible study notes, are that 17 is kind of the key number here, because 17 was a number that's a number of completeness, a number of life, and so 17 times 3 is also kind of like the number of the Trinity, number of God, and those numbers together are part of it, and it represented the fishers of men, right? The all of the world. Austin,
so
you gave
Augustine.
That was Augustine, and then you put the note in our doc that Jerome also suggested that at the time, the knowledge was that there were 153 different types of fish, and so that was the gospel is going to go to all people. A lot of ones are like that, like Saint Cyril. And there are several commentators that had it. It's 100, it's 50, and it's 3, with 100 being like a very large number. So like Saint Cyril said, it is the great number of those who will be caught, which is the Gentiles, which is like the whole world. 50 is the smaller number, it's the Jews, and then 3 is the Trinity, or like a select few, something like that. There were several people that used the 100, the 50, and the 3. I don't think that's super likely, because I don't think that sort of like base 10 decimal thinking was kind of, I don't know, like X plus Y plus Z was not usually how Bible writers do their number symbols.
I feel like they usually use like a base 12 system.
Or something like that. So that like the sum of 3 numbers that are round multiples of 10. I don't buy it. 17 as the number of life and wholeness. It's also pointed out, I saw one that said 17 was the number of people groups that were referenced in the day of Pentecost, like when it lists all of the arcs. And so so it another way it could represent all nations. And then the most mundane, and then the weirdest ones, right? So I think just to keep our escalating weirdness, there was 2 that I thought were the most fascinating, I guess is the nice way to say it. But one this is the nerdiest one, was that John was writing to a Greek audience, and the Greeks really appreciated wisdom and philosophy, and like that was where like the mathematics and the like geometry was coming from, and that the number 153 is the denominator of Archimedes' approximation of the square root of 3, and it was part of it's in a bunch of spots in one of his really famous approximations of pi.
Okay.
And the number, if you look at the proof that Archimedes used to prove this, the number 153 is in there a lot, and so maybe that referenced. So this one, which I read this, it's from a blog called defendingthebride.com. I don't know anything about these people.
I'm already already
It
going,
was
ugh.
it was made the website was made in 2005 and it looks like it, but this was a fascinating rabbit trail. So his theory was the fish represent wisdom and the number of them represent all of the wisdom available to man, both Greek and Christian. The 153 was like, here's the Greek. The net did not tear to prove that there is no inconsistency between Greek and Christian wisdom. When they got to the beach, Jesus already had fish because he is the source of all wisdom.
Whoa, okay, okay.
And
I mean, I can kind of get on board with the last part.
you're right, and then the specific number of fish was how it referenced that it was Greek wisdom, because that was a fun nerd number for people who were into Greek math.
Got it.
And then the
Wow.
square root of 3 is also used if you're graphing like the fish shape. The square root of 3 is in there, so that's the 153 is also in that. So
Wow.
that was a fun little journey. And
No kidding.
yeah, and then the most mundane that is this made me laugh because it kind of makes sense, is that it actually doesn't mean anything, and that most of the Gospel of John is real spooky, real mystic, real symbolic, and that number is specific enough to say that it's not an exaggeration. This was a real number. This was a lot of fish.
Whoa, I kind of like that.
And then there's all
the
and then there's
idea
also
that
a
like,
bunch of weird like end times prophecy stuff that was like, oh,
of
this
course, well, there always
people,
are.
yeah, because there's always like, well, if you do it in base 120, it's the number of days until the rapture, and it's like that's when I had to
Right.
pull out. I was like, all right, I'm going dark places.
Yeah, legit. No, I feel like this idea, like a couple things there, like the idea of there are several ideas that seem like they have really good basis, right? Like the idea,
Hmm.
whether it's the idea that like there's 153 kinds of fish and that means the whole world, or like large numbers like 100 mean the whole world, or things like that. Like the idea of like the fish meaning there's there's room for everybody feels like that is
Yeah.
consistent with the larger arc of scripture that we know, right? The idea of fish as wisdom and Jesus being the source of wisdom, that's consistent with the scripture that we know. So like looking at some of these theories, I feel like some of the, like I said before, it's important to be able to hold lots of these, but it's also important to be able to ask which of these are consistent with the God that we
Right.
know throughout the rest of the story. And then that can help us figure out which of these theories is actually helpful or could be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The math stuff is, I think, less like the Archimedes stuff. I think is slightly less silly than on the surface, just because like the beginning, right, of this, the in the beginning was the word, the logos, like the book starts with kind of a direct reference to some Greek
Very Greek
philosophy. The
theology,
readers,
yeah.
the Greek philosophy, the readers would have been expected to know.
Mhm.
So there is like, maybe this is a nerdy Greek thing, is I don't think completely unfounded, and I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, we got to stop talking about fish because even though it's
Yes.
great, we got to finish our story.
Yes.
So, okay, this is going to be my moment to nerd out when we talk about this next section about language. So, we're going to read verses 15 through 19 here. It's the next section of our story. Peter, you want to read this section?
Sure. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me."
So, we get three questions of Peter that are, of course, meant to mirror the three denials that Peter does toward Jesus before the crucifixion. And so there's this really important moment between Jesus and Peter, right? Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about these three questions that Jesus asks and the three things that Peter answers with, because some English translations do a great job showing the differences in the questions by using different words. They do that on
Hmm.
purpose because the Greek words are different, right? So in the version that Peter just read, for instance, Jesus said, in the first question, Jesus says, tend my sheep. And then in the second time, Jesus says, feed my sheep. And then the third time, Jesus says, or no, did I get that wrong? Hold on.
Starts with feed my lambs, tend
Feed
my
my
sheep,
lambs, tend
and
my
then feed
sheep,
my
feed
sheep.
my sheep, right?
Mm.
So that difference in English is on purpose because the words in Greek are different. Jesus is saying to do different things to the sheep, and the first time he says lambs, and the second two times he says sheep, right? So that's like a sort of maybe innocuous difference between the three is the different words Jesus uses for what to do and then what kind of sheep he's talking about. But the more interesting differences, I think, in this are the things that Peter, the question that Jesus asks Peter, asking if Peter loves him, and then Peter's response. So if you're like me and you grew up in an evangelical church, and maybe even in other churches, you maybe heard sermons at some point about the different kinds of love in the Greek world, talking about like agape and philos, and what's the other one I'm forgetting? There's a different agape, philos, and I'm
Well,
sure some people
Eros is the romantic
and
one.
eros. I think that's the third one that I'm forgetting. So like there's different kinds of love in Greek, right? And they mean different things in general. So you've probably heard a sermon like that at some point in your life if you've been in church a long time. And different words are used here. So when Jesus first asked Peter and Jesus says, do you love me? Jesus used the word, uh, uh, a version of the word agape, right? And Jesus says, do you agape me, essentially? And in those first two times, when Jesus asks this, the first time Jesus says, do you love me, agape? The second time Jesus says, do you love me, agape? And Peter responds both times with a different word, with the word that's the phile or philo. And that's a different word for love. So the reason this is interesting is because it seems like Jesus is saying, do you love me in this particular way? And Peter is saying, I love you in this particular way. It's a different kind of love. And so the third time Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, he uses the form that Peter has been using. Jesus says, do you love me with the philo base or filio base? Jesus says, philes, do you love me in that way? And then Peter replies and says that he does with that same word. So the first two times, it's almost like Jesus is saying, do you love me like this? And Peter's like, yes, but I love you like this. And then finally at the end, Jesus says, okay, do you love me like that? And Peter's like, yes, I do. So there's a difference in the way that they're talking about what kind of love it
Mhm.
is. And though it may be that there's no real difference meant between between the agape love and the philo love. It may be that there's no real difference there. Some commentators say that it doesn't really matter because it does say like the third time Jesus asks this, meaning that it was the same as the first two times. So I can understand people being like, you know what, it doesn't really matter. But I kind of like the reading of this text that Jesus is asking for a kind of love that Peter doesn't know how to give at first. A lot of times when we talk about agape love, we talk about it being this divine type of love that like it's really we wonder sometimes if people are even capable of that particular pure kind of love. And so when Jesus is asking this of Peter, I kind of wonder if Peter knows that he can't quite give that type of love, but here's the type I can give, right? To say like, well, this is as good as I got. Is this good enough? And then for Jesus at the end in the third question to say, yes, that's good. That's good enough, Peter. That's what I want. Um, so I kind of like that reading of Jesus saying, you know what I want is what you're able to give. So I wonder, what do you all think of that reading?
Yeah, I mean, I do, and this is less for scholarly reasons and more just because I feel very connected to this character, so to speak.
Mhm.
But I've always really, and in fact, like even reading it was feeling a little emotional, just because I feel like this is kind of referencing back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Like Peter has not recovered from the fact that he uh, like betrayed the person he loves. You
Mhm.
know, that's just such a devastating reality in his life. Um, like he failed at the one thing he said he would never fail at, the thing that his life was centered on. And so I don't think it's like, I don't know if you all have ever read Dorothy Sayers' radio play based on the Gospels, The Man Who Became. But it's just one of my favorite like pieces of literature, and she really interprets this scene as like the other disciples have started to absorb the joy of the resurrection, and Peter is not there yet. you know, like he just can't really get past his own failure. And this is Jesus like reaching out to him and like giving him that opportunity for healing. um but like the fact that Jesus is like, do you love me, in this way that feels uh kind of like a perfect love, right?
Yeah.
And then Peter says, but I can't do that, clearly I can't. I let you down, I messed this up, you know um and so I really love that, Austin, of so like that is kind of what this question and answer feels like to me. um but I love the fact then that Jesus, like you were saying, meets him where he is, um, and says, "It's okay. I'll take what you got, basically, because I want to be in loving relationship with you."
Yeah. What's really interesting is if you read it, and Amory said in the chat that agape is typically associated with the full self-sacrificial love, right? You can read this as Jesus like settling, right? Being like, all right, man, I know what you can give. But then after this, he tells Peter how he's going to be murdered.
Right.
And so you're gonna get there, Peter, basically.
Yeah, right. That he couldn't get Peter to say it. And yep. Peter said, look, you know everything. And then Peter tells him, like, you're going to do that act of love. And that's really cool.
It is. And like, I wonder, this is, a question, that like, we've got the sort of editorializing moment, right? Where it says like, this is because this was the kind of death that he was going to die, right? Which is the sort of the writer, the person who put pen to paper explaining to us what happened there. But I wonder what Peter felt in that moment of like, was that a good thing to know that, like, first of all, did Peter connect that to Jesus actually saying something about his death? And if he did, was that a moment where he was like, great, I will get to that point of experiencing agape? Or was Peter like, oh no, like, I wonder what his experience was in that moment.
I think if I was writing the story of this, like, to me, what makes sense and what to fit Peter's arc, if this is a repeat, right? Like maybe he didn't get it until it was on him. And just like, the third time the rooster crowed, he was like, oh, this is that.
Right.
And it was shame that brought to him. I wonder if when he was about to meet his end, he had the same kind of flashback and got to feel a little better about himself.
Well, or maybe again, he had no idea sort of what Jesus was talking about, but it was still a communication of like, I have a plan for you, Peter.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, this is not the end of like your path in following me.
Right. I feel like this will be kind of touching on one of our takeaway questions. But to me, when I read this section where Jesus gives Peter a chance to redeem himself, right? To say like, just for every one of those times you denied me, you get to profess your love for me, right?
Yep.
3 and 3. And in that moment, it looks to me like what we talk about when we talk about restorative justice, that like in restorative justice, you ask the person who has been harmed what it is that they need, not to have some sort of penal, like, this is the punishment for doing a thing, but like, what does the victim need, right? So what did Jesus need? Maybe Jesus needed to hear that from Peter, that Peter loved him, right? And then what does the community need? The community needs to have a sense of like closure between these two people, right? The community needs to know that Peter is still loved by Jesus, even though he screwed up majorly. So like, this to me is a really great example of restorative justice and like what restorative justice in communities can look like, which I think is really cool that we get a model for that here at the end of this gospel.
I also wonder, like, because it's both justice, right? Again, that Jesus was betrayed, that was a harm done and that needed to be restored, but it's also like it's a mentoring moment, right? Like he had this moment while he's telling him like, hey, you're going to be in charge here, basically, you have responsibility on the flock.
Right.
And then after the third time is when Jesus was like, all right, feed the sheep. It's going to get real hard, man.
Mhm.
Right. But like, maybe like, Peter also probably personally needed to undo,
Right.
the things. And, I wonder if it was that third exchange.
Mhm.
Now he's ready.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, Amory is reminding us of the tradition that says that when Peter was crucified, he asked to be crucified upside down, like in a different way, so that he wouldn't like, in sort of like not calling attention to himself or putting himself on the same level as Jesus. So it's an interesting part of our tradition too that looks at how Peter is treated in that moment. Also, hello to Julia, who I just saw in the chat. Good to have you here. Um, so yeah, so we've got this back and forth between Peter and Jesus, um, and then we've got this last section. Sam, do you want to read verses 20 through 25?
Yes, which is good because I think this adds one piece of flavor onto things that I think will be fun to discuss.
Nice.
So starting in 20, it says, Peter turned and saw following them the disciple whom Jesus loved, who had lain close to his breast at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. The saying spread abroad among the brethren that this disciple was not to die, yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, and we may know that his testimony is true. But there was also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So, a couple pieces here. This is a weird ending. Like this whole section, this whole last chapter feels like the after credit scene in a movie anyway, right? Like, like the credits are done, lights come back on and now they're fishing. Like it has that vibe it has that vibe already. And then you have this like dialogue at the end from the writer about what it means and what people have thought about it. And it feels like, when you're at a movie and there's a clip afterwards of the director coming on saying like, hey guys, thanks for watching the film. It's structurally strange.
Well, I feel like it's almost the polar opposite of what happens in Mark, where it's just like,
right,
and they ran away and never told anybody, and cut, fade to black.
Right.
Like where Mark just like cuts off. John is like, I'll give you a satisfying ending.
Right. Whereas Mark, you're looking up at the projector and you're like, was that it? Like, did it, what? Did it break? But there's a couple things that I think put just an interesting twist on things. Cause like we have this idea of Peter and the exchange that just happened, as this moment of, like raising him up for leadership, getting him ready, doing a lot of redemption. And I think there's some of that. But the disciple Jesus loved uses that agape phrase, and Peter is told he's going to die, and then Peter asks, what about that guy? And Jesus says, maybe he lives forever, what do you care? But like, I feel like it is part a redemption act for Peter, but you could also read not getting to that agape as maybe not a full redemption act, and this is a passing of the torch to John. And this is why John is the beloved disciple, and this is why this is the founding text of this school of people that followed John. Like maybe this is also like the hero moment for John in this, that John and Jesus had a more special relationship, and that's why this gospel happened. That's why they follow him. That's an interesting possible read of this, that this is that this is an Elisha moment almost, right? Like the mantle's passed. This is why our school of thought is founded around this book that John wrote and not one of Peter's. This is sort of why this is our guy. And I think like that relies on some historical criticism theories, right? That this is not this may or may not be handwritten by John, that this may be written by his students later. It works if it's written by John, but I don't know, it's a strange ending that I think makes a little more sense in a context like that. And I think it also helps explain like these weird endnotes. Because like I saw a theory, right, that there was a teaching earlier of this thing Jesus said. And so a lot of people were expecting Jesus to return before John died. And that maybe when this was compiled, John had died.
Mhm.
And so part of this was damage control on like, no, that's not actually what Jesus said. Is that maybe he could, and if he did, then that's Jesus's prerogative. Um,
Mhm.
but so that's just interesting historical notes that I think give some, I don't know, some flavor to this. That's fun to think about.
Yeah, I
On a
see that
more, yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Oh, here, Amory asked in the chat, was this ending added in a later manuscript? And so the interesting thing here is that people, first, a lot of the reasons we're talking about, people did think for a while that chapter 21 of John was added later. And so in some versions, you'll see a text note, like older. When I say older, I mean like pre 1920 or so. You'll see notes that are like, this was added in a later text. So for a while, they did think 21 was added later. And then more physical evidence came about that said that no, this was part of the original text. So it went back and forth for a long time about whether this was added later or whether it was original to the text. Right now, we think it's original to the text.
Yeah, but I think like the oldest John we have is still just like 80 AD,
Right.
right? Like I've like
Yep.
John's one we don't like we have it's more modern of a manuscript than some of the others that we have as far as how far back our record goes.
Yeah.
But I think that's super interesting, and I like to revel in it because Austin, as you said at the beginning, I grew up not being allowed to think about this, so I enjoy nerding out over the different things this could be done, what kind of community it could have been used in, why they may have
Mhm.
written some strange things in it. Um, I also, I don't know, like I also just find it kind of a cool possibility that this is an elevation of John because obviously like all scripture is God breathed and useful for teaching, but the Gospel of John has had a lot more impact on your average person's theology than First and Second Peter have. And that's,
True.
like even if this was a little cheeky of a like, here's why this is our guy, the Gospel of John has changed our culture like direct, like if it's one of the ones, if you took this out, we would have a different Christianity. Like there's a lot, like, so this is a really special gospel with really special insights. And so I don't think it's purely cynical to say that this was a like, here's why John had something different than Peter did. I think
Mhm.
it tracks with what this is and how it's been used.
It does, yeah. And you're right. There's so much about this gospel that, yeah, so much of our theology stems from this gospel. And we put up with the fact that it's not like the synoptics
Yeah.
because it has so much to say,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on a more practical, normal Bible study moment, uh, I do like Peter asks, like, so what about this guy? And
Mhm.
Jesus says, don't worry about it. Follow me. And I think that's a really good reminder, right? Because
Mhm.
I feel like, especially in this day and age where we are online and I am on Twitter reading what everybody thinks about everything kind of every second of every day, it's good to have some reminders, right? Hey, also, like, you don't have to worry that everyone else falls exactly in lockstep with you. You follow Jesus. Do what you know you've been called to do, and you work out yours, and other people are following Jesus too. And you don't need to know everything that was said to them or thought about them or that they go. And so we all have our own journey to be on. And that's a good reminder.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yes. So that's where we're going to wrap things up today, is with those two sort of final thoughts for everybody to take with them. One being going back to that sense of like of restorative justice. What does it mean for how we, can be in community, or how we should be in community with each other, that we could practice a restorative justice that looks like that conversation between Jesus and Peter, right? That looks like, centering the people who are harmed, centering the community, rather than just like the sort of retributive sort of punishment for the sake of punishment. What does it look like to bring people back into community in that moment? So how does that work? How does the story tell us about how we should be in community with each other when it comes to, like what Sam said, not worrying about those other people, like if they're doing things a little bit different than you, if they understand their gender a little bit different than you and they use different language than you do, right? If they understand their faith a little bit different from you, that's okay. none of your business sometimes. So thinking about that, how are we called to be community? And then the other takeaway question, which is this story focuses a lot on eating, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of the post-resurrection scenes do, probably like realistically, because people wanted something that told them that Jesus wasn't just a ghost fluttering around, that Jesus could actually eat, right? And was there in body. But I think it's important for us to think about how care of the body seems to be really important to Jesus, that like our bodies matter in these stories and today. So, how does our care for our body's needs play into our experience of spirituality? How does our care for our bodies matter when we're talking about our faith? So, those are our takeaway questions for the day. Thank you all for being here with us, for hanging out in the chat. Thank you so much to Peter and to Sam for being here to chat about this great passage. Our final closing announcements are, let's see, we have our once a month non-binary support group is meeting tomorrow. So if you want to get involved and go to the non-binary support group that meets monthly, I'm putting the link for that in the chat. Theoretically, there we go. So that's in the chat. We also have a community hangout on the 29th. And you can find out information about that on our website. And if you want to get signed up for our newsletter, you can do that as well. If you're like, hey, how am I supposed to know when these Bible studies are happening? You can look on our website and you can look at the newsletter. So links are to those things in the chat as well. So you can keep up with all the things that we're up to. That's all. Anybody have anything else they want to say?
As just a sub takeaway, I also like the permission for things to be weird in this chapter, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's stuff that was explained really explicitly. There's stuff that was left ambiguous and weird. That's how it works, and it's cool.
Yeah, the permission to allow yourself to think about different possibilities.
Yeah.
I love that. All right. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and we'll see y'all again soon. Bye.